Okay, so this is just going to carry on from the last video that I did. After Detective Smith threatened me that if I didn't shut up about what happened, police and the Crown would charge me with a criminal offense and throw me in jail. That upset me, and I consulted a couple of lawyers. I consulted Joseph McAllister, who said it was the job of police to fabricate evidence, and he said no court in the land would find in my favor, which I also found. I found that just as disturbing. And Bernie Hawkins, he said he didn't know what police could charge me with unless the crimes I was reporting weren't true. And then he said he thought they might charge me with mischief, but that never happened because, you know, everything I was telling the police was true, and I think they knew that. But over the next 10 years, I was wrongly arrested and prosecuted 3 times. I was twice put in jail. The first time I was put in jail for 36 days without access to a telephone for much of that time, and I couldn't hire counsel. And then when I finally did get access to a phone in the middle of the night when there was a disturbance, and I didn't have any phone book or anything, I didn't know any numbers, how am I going to phone anybody in the middle of the night? And but there was a sign by the payphone that had, you know, for the ombudsman, and I phoned the ombudsman and I left a message. And then they threw me in solitary confinement after that. I'd been in segregated confinement and no access to much of anything. Anyway, so, and then they assigned a lawyer. Like, I tried to get my own lawyer. They gave me a list of lawyer and a telephone, said, oh, you can hire a lawyer. But then the lawyer I asked to represent me didn't come. Another lawyer came and said, I'm your lawyer. And then he didn't act in my best interest at all. He just, you know, acted for the Crown, essentially. Anyway, and the second time they put me in jail, it was in Lindsay. They put me in a cell all covered in fresh blood. You know, I'm sure it wasn't human blood, but I mean, come on, it's just nasty, eh? Anyway, when I was in Chatham, and that's after the first time they put me in jail, they falsely accused me after I had reported yet another threat. And they arrested me and charged me with threatening. And that was not long after I had received a package from the Information and Privacy Commission telling me, you know, they gave me a date for my appeal and told me how, you know, the process for submitting supporting documentation. So it was just shortly after I got that letter, and they held me in jail until after I missed the deadline and my appeal was dismissed. And then the Crown Attorney told the court it was essential I be released. He lied. That's James A. Ramsey. He's now a judge, and he should not be a judge because he lied. He lied to the court. I mean, maybe Crown Attorneys, maybe that's what they do, but you know what? It's wrong. It is really, really wrong. He lied. He lied. He said that I had been homeless. I was homeless. Well, no, I wasn't. I had an address that I'd had, a permanent address I'd had for 10 years, and I had a rental address that I was paid up a month in advance. You know, first and last month's rent I was paid right up. I wasn't homeless. That doesn't qualify me as homeless. And he said that I had no money, and I had no assets. Well, I did. I had a diamond ring that was worth $6,000, and this piece of property I had that was worth $45,000. And not a lot of money. I had but that's some assets. It doesn't qualify me as indigent exactly. I mean, they weren't money in the bank, and I couldn't eat them, but I could have sold them if I had to, you know. And he told the court that I had lived in my mother's basement until she died, and then been homeless ever since. Well, I never lived in my mother's basement. I never lived in my mother's basement. I stayed with my mother for like 2 weeks after I moved. You know, I left London because of that repeat sex offender drove me out of London, and I stayed with my mother for a couple of weeks until I got an apartment of my own. That doesn't qualify me for living in my mother's basement until she died. She died in 1988, and I moved back to Toronto in the late 70s. So, I mean, I don't know where this James A. Ramsey, and the worst lie that he told the court, he told the court I was schizophrenic. Well, I'm not schizophrenic. And, I told him, I said, listen, the sex offender, Paul Kirchhoff, I was awarded compensation by criminal injuries, and Paul Kirchhoff got a confession. The doctor that said I was, that the sex crimes was a delusion, he was reprimanded by Dr. Casper's tutors at the University of Toronto. And James Ramsey, he went off the record then. He said, go off the record, and he got right in my face, and he said, that never happened, that never happened, that never happened, you're schizophrenic. So he was saying the sex assault, the 2-day sex assault by Daryl Dart, where he held me captive. He had a screwdriver, he held it to my eyeball, and he dragged it down and held it to my throat, and he dragged it down my stomach, and he held it to my stomach. He held me for 2 days, he tied me up, and he repeatedly, orally, anally, and vaginally, figure it out to unconsciousness over and over and over again for 2 days. And James Ramsey, who wasn't there, and it was 30 years earlier, what the heck was he bringing it up for? He said, that never happened, that never happened. What the heck did he think he knew about it, and why was he bringing it up? The police charged me with threatening because I had left a voicemail for PC Onik, George Onik, at the Niagara Regional Police, telling him I'd been threatened yet again, and that if police couldn't defend me, if the two men that had said they were going to come back and force entry, one of whom said that if the mob was going to whack me, they wouldn't waste a bullet, just explode you in your car. So those two, if they came back and made good, like the second guy, Don Cousy, he'd just been at my door and said he was coming back with a guy who said they're gonna explode me in my car, and they're gonna force entry and make me do whatever they wanted. And I told George Onik, I left him a message and said, if police can't help me, I'll do whatever I need to do to defend myself. I'm not going to be a willing victim. And then they arrested me and charged me with threatening for saying I was going to defend myself. So anyway, and James A. Ramsey told the court a whole pack of lies to make sure that I didn't get bail, because apparently they wanted me kept in jail so that I missed the deadline to submit supporting documents, and so that my appeal to the Information Privacy Commission for access to previously redacted Hamilton Police Service records would be dismissed. And you know what? That's really, really a bad thing to do. I don't care who they are. Whoever did that, really bad. And, a Gowling's lawyer, after I moved to Chatham, a Gowling's lawyer told me, he said the intent of the harassment was to drive me crazy, then to rely on mental health law to find me unfit, and to get a treatment order to detain me indefinitely in psychiatric custody without a trial of any evidence. I wrote to Erwin Kotler about that because I wanted to document it, and I remembered that he had represented Andrei Sakharov as part of his international legal team, because that's exactly the kind of thing they were doing in the Soviet Union, to silence dissenters against the government. And I thought, it's a really serious thing to do. And twice the Crown, they tried that too. They got psychiatrist Isabel Cote, and bless her heart, she found no mental illness. Certainly no access one. She said adjustment disorder, which means basically you're in jail and you're stressed because you're in jail, and you get out of jail and you won't have your symptoms anymore. But she found no schizophrenia. And then the second one in Lindsay, they said, we're going to do a forensic assessment just based on police records. Those police records that I'd been denied access to. Yep, those records. And they said, that's the way it's always done. That's bullshit. I know that because I've got a master's degree in education with a psychology. I'm qualified as a psychologist, and I know how assessments are done. They're done on interviews and testing. Anyway, the same Gowling's lawyer, he told me his firm could not represent my interest because of a conflict of interest with doctors at the federal level, and it took me a long time to identify what doctor at the federal level might have it in for me. But then I realized that the brother of the man who date raped me in university, so Bill Musto was the man who date raped me, and his brother is Richard Musto. Richard Musto was a psychiatrist, and he had worked for Health Canada for 10 years. He's the only doctor I know who's at the federal level. He had top security access to personal records and could easily have done what the OPP officer said might have happened, that someone who didn't like me put falsehoods into my personal records. The man who date raped me, Bill Musto, also had top security clearance in his job with the Canadian International Development Agency. And after he raped me, he hung around for about 20 years until I got married, basically. And he left for Africa to work for CETA. And when I reported his rape to Tim Cassidy at the London police, Musto told me he knows the RCMP who do those sorts of investigation, and that CETA had given him, quote, big knives to defend myself with, end quote. And I believe the RCMP officer he referred to was a man with whom he grew up in Montreal, that I witnessed him buy drugs from Bill Musto. And that's kind of what precipitated the rape, actually. I told him, he had asked me to marry him, and I said, you quit dealing drugs, I'm not going to marry you unless you quit dealing drugs. And then after that, and that was over the phone, and then he came to London. He'd been dealing drugs across the border, Washington State, by air, and across Canada, and he came back from Vancouver, and he raped me, and then he went back to Vancouver and picked up the drug dealing. Anyway, and around the time that I consulted the Gowlings lawyer, Larry Smith from Public Complaints Against the RCMP contacted me completely out of the blue and suggested there might be an alternative way to resolve any complaint against the RCMP I might be planning to make. And at the time, I had not yet put it together, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And I told him so. I might have to make yet another video, maybe not. Anyway, after I recovered from the assaults I was the victim of in my 20s, I better make another video.